The common narrative of the East Bloc is that all the members of the bloc were politically and economically subordinated to the Soviet Union, and they were completely incapable of acting of their own accord. For this reason, some people wonder why the USSR didn't just annex the entire bloc. This image of the East Bloc, however, isn't entirely accurate. East Bloc nations all had a degree of sovereignty and autonomy from the USSR. Though it wasn't common, and in fact was discouraged, East Bloc nations would act of their own accord when they could get away with it. Romania and Albania are great examples of this, as when the USSR ordered the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, these two nations were the only ones to refuse participation. As a matter of fact, the president of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, took it a step farther and outright condemned the USSR for ordering the invasion. This also goes to show, however, that even though nations had a certain amount of autonomy in the East Bloc, the USSR was still willing to shut down opposition, even by military force, if they felt it was necessary to do so. Wouldn't any dissent from Moscow be rooted out of Eastern Europe much easier if they just would have annexed the entire region? Why didn't the USSR just outright annex the East Bloc, and what would have happened if they decided to do so? Let's take a look at the history and the politics of this region of the world and see how things could have played out differently. The USSR, prior to their entry into World War II, signed a non-aggression pact with Germany due to their failure to sign any kind of security deals with Britain or France. This pact was called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. On top of guarantees of non-aggression between the USSR and Germany, it also created grounds for both countries to set up spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. The pact gave the USSR claims on the Baltics, Finland, Eastern Poland, and Bessarabia, which was a region of Romania and is today an independent state called Moldova. The USSR was able to consolidate control of all of these countries except Finland. The USSR did attempt an invasion of Finland, which went absolutely terrible, so only a few small border changes were made in favor of the USSR. This treaty was broken by the Nazi government in Germany when they launched a full-scale land invasion of the USSR on June 22, 1941. The Soviets were completely caught off guard by this attack, and the Germans made astonishing progress, breaking through the Baltics, Belarus, Ukraine, and even started moving troops into the northern Caucasus region, as well as making it right outside of Leningrad and Moscow. An encirclement in Stalingrad of German troops by the Soviets would allow them to push the Germans completely out of the Caucasus and save Leningrad, as well as liberating Ukraine and large parts of Belarus by the summer of 1944. The Soviets would manage to liberate most of the Baltics by October of 1944, and even began pushing into Romania and Bulgaria by November of 1944 due to the landing of the Allies in the West. The USSR would crush the last of the German army in the east, and the Allies would meet up with them by March of 1945. The peace deal that Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union would come up with would see Germany divided into spheres of influence, and the USSR would keep control over the Baltics, Eastern Poland, which was divided between Belarus and Ukraine, and Moldova. The USSR would consolidate its authority over Eastern Europe by assisting the rise of communist parties in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. This is a major point in why the USSR didn't just annex Eastern Europe. All of these countries were established as fully independent nations that just happened to come under Soviet influence. If the USSR even began to insinuate that they wanted to fully consolidate Eastern Europe as a part of its union, the West would have been absolutely pissed and terrified. The local populations of Eastern Europe wouldn't be too happy with being fully incorporated into the USSR either. In our own timeline, uprisings popped up in Eastern Europe by the local populations because they didn't want to be completely subjugated to the will of the USSR, and several military interventions took place. Two major examples of this were in Hungary and in Czechoslovakia, when the USSR used military force to shut down uprisings. The USSR already had to rebuild itself after the absolute slog on the Eastern Front in World War II. The communist parties of the local governments in Eastern Europe were able to focus on rebuilding themselves and consolidating their own authority. If the USSR annexed all of these countries outright, they would not only need to reconstruct their post-war territory, but also all the new unloyal territories. On top of all of this, Western Europe and the United States would most certainly consider such an action completely unacceptable and would assist resistance movements in the newly acquired territory of the USSR. It is the combination of all of these reasons that the USSR would rather set up a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe than to just annex the whole region. Complete integration of Eastern Europe would have absolutely no benefits for the USSR. It's pretty much for the same reason they didn't annex Mongolia. They could have all the benefits of having the country under their influence without any drawbacks from annexation. In my video, What If the USSR Annexed Mongolia, I go into a lot more detail about Mongolia specifically. So if you would like to know more about Mongolia during the Cold War, I recommend you watch that video and check out some of the sources I used to make it, which are linked in the description of all of my videos. So what if despite all of these factors, the USSR decided for whatever reason to annex Eastern Europe? Let's assume that at the end of World War II, rather than setting up independent nation states that would later be integrated into a sphere of influence, they announced full annexation of all of their occupied territories. We already discussed much of what would have happened if this annexation took place. So now let's look at exactly how things would have played out. How the internal borders of the USSR would look is hard to predict, but I can imagine it would look something like this. A Kaliningrad Republic would be established, Romania would keep Bessarabia, East Germany would lose less land to Poland, and Poland would likely keep more land that was supposed to be given to Ukraine and Belarus. From the get-go, the Union would begin showing signs of unrest and discontent. Remember how even in our timeline, many people in Eastern Europe rebelled against the Soviet-dominated regimes they were forced to live under? Now imagine that times 1,000,000. The Union would attempt reconstruction, but would find itself distracted trying to put down guerrilla warfighters all throughout its new territory. The industrial sector would be fully dedicated to stabilizing control over all this new land. This mess would remain the norm for the USSR until the death of Stalin in 1953. In this timeline, I think it is unlikely that anyone emerges from the power vacuum opened by Stalin's death. Instead, the whole Union would plunge into a massacre, with all the potential successors of Stalin going at it with each other at the same time that there are armed resistance movements all throughout the Union. During this process, some states would declare their independence from the USSR. Nationalist dictators would emerge in these new states, and they would likely fight with each other over territory. It is also likely that Russian minorities in these newly emerging regimes would rebel with support from the USSR, like how in Yugoslavia, Serbian nationalists rebelled in Croatia and in Bosnia with Yugoslav support. This absolute mess would carry on for at least a decade. What Eastern Europe would look like by the time everything is said and done is impossible to say, but what is certain is that 1. East Germany would reunite with the West, and that the USSR most likely wouldn't exist anymore, and if it did, it would be a shell of its former self. Assuming the USSR disappears completely, I assume Russia would likely make an attempt to establish some kind of sphere of regional influence like in our timeline, but if the USSR manages to somehow preserve itself, it would be an isolated state that would be focused solely on repairing itself. I personally think that it is likely that fighting between Eastern European countries would continue even after the main course of conflict is over. If the USSR decided to shoot themselves in the foot by annexing all of Eastern Europe, they would have laid the groundworks for an ethnic conflict like what happened in Yugoslavia, only on a much more massive scale. The casualties of such a conflict would be comparable to World War I and II. Eastern Europe would be completely destroyed, and the entire world would be shocked by instability. There is usually a method to the madness when it comes to the way that nation-states expand their territory and influence. The states that expand the fastest, like Hitler's Germany and Napoleon's France, or even Genghis Khan's Mongolia, happen to also be the ones that fall the fastest. The USSR had everything it needed by consolidating its influence over Eastern Europe. Truly, there was absolutely zero reason that the USSR would want to take full control of Eastern Europe. Hell, They weren't even in the business of expanding into territory that wasn't formally part of the Russian Empire anyways.
The only reason this would ever happen is if Joseph Stalin was smoking the wrong chains.
Anyways, what do you guys think would have happened if the USSR decided to, for some reason, annex Eastern Europe? Feel free to let me know in the comments below. And feel free to like and subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.